Association Communication and Engagement Committee. And I just thought it would be useful, while opening the session, just to give you a brief outline of what the PSA is aiming to do and involved with. We essentially exist to promote and support the study of politics, political science, and we're interested in supporting academics when disseminating their research beyond the ivory towers. And with that in mind, we have our traditional media briefings, which historically, routinely have always been held in sort of April and May, and this year we've got those traditional briefings looking at the local elections, the London mayoral elections, and also the EU referendum. And then we have alternative briefings, research-led briefings such as this, where we are keen to encourage and facilitate the dissemination of research as widely as possible. This project is particularly interesting given the data that it is anchored in. One of the problems historically has been gathering comparative data on the extent to which citizens of immigrant origin are represented within our political and civic life. So I will stop there because I'm not the expert and the panelists aren't. And what we're going to do is we're going to have 3 short presentations of 10 minutes each, looking at different aspects of the project, and then we'll open up and we'll have a Q&A and a roundtable discussion. So our first presentation by Professor Thomas Saalfeld is titled General Presentation of the Project Goals and the Approach.
Thank you. I will try and be very brief and give you a short outline. What we are fundamentally interested in is representation. Representation is very difficult to define, but we will use 2 types of notions of representation. One is usually referred to as descriptive, and I'll say a few words about what that means, and one substantive. Descriptive representation simply means representativeness or representativity. To what extent does the composition of a representative body, like House of Commons or House of Lords, reflect the composition of the population it's meant to represent? In the literature, this has been sort of captured by the phrase "standing for." Substantive representation is more to what extent are the representatives responsive to the preferences of the representatives. That's often captured by acting for, but it also includes justifying policies, explaining policies. Substantive representation may or may not be associated with people who are descriptively represented. That is, the concerns of citizens of immigrant origin could be represented well or badly by MPs from these kind of groups, or they could be represented equally well or badly by mainstream majority society MPs. So those are the 2 foci of the study. One interest that we have in particular is how descriptive representation actually influences substantive representation, and whether MPs from immigrant backgrounds are different in comparison to mainstream MPs in terms of what they do in Parliament. That is really new. There are some data, and Matt Goodwin is right in pointing out we don't really have very good comparative data, but there are data about how many members of immigrant origin are in some parliaments in some periods of time. Our study will be much more comprehensive and systematic. But the interesting thing that has not been explored at all is what are these people actually doing once they are in parliament, and how do they compare to majority society, if you want to use that phrase. And of course, you could also ask yourself, what does stronger substantive representation, stronger articulation of the views, perspectives, experiences of citizens of immigrant origin in Parliament, but what will that do in the future to encourage for descriptive representation? ethnic minority candidates to actually stand for election, to compete for office, etc. So those are our interests. We are very clear that we cannot study this without looking very carefully at political parties, and here we are different from the dominant US literature on this, where the focus on political parties is not as systematic as in our case. And what do we mean by party? We mean by parties, party in the electorate, that is the people who associate or identify with a political party amongst the voters. We know, for example, that ethnic minority MPs, ethnic minorities in the UK have certain party preferences. These are changing, and that will have an influence on descriptive representation. We mean parties as organizations. That means the kind of bodies that actually nominate candidates for election, and parties in government, that is the parliamentary parties, which are ultimately in charge of policy making. But also we are interested in the party system dynamics. There's the interaction between political parties. For example, what happens if a right-wing party appears in parliament or on the scene? How do the other parties respond to that? What dynamics are beginning to evolve if that happens, or if no such party exists in the party system? So that is one of the bundles of that is a whole bundle of variables of factors that have to be seen to be happening before it comes to descriptive representation or substantive representation. We're very interested in that. And then, of course, we look at the wider context of this. We look at the structure of public opinion, the attitude towards immigrants, representation of minorities may vary between countries, but also within countries, between regions or individuals. And it matters, of course, for example, for the political parties that nominate or may not nominate candidates of immigrant origin. We look at the institutional context, think of electoral systems, we look at policies at the national level in particular, the policies, for example, that facilitate citizenship or create barriers for the acquisition of citizenship. We look at constituency demographics. Does it matter whether an immigrant origin candidate runs for office in a constituency that is predominantly non-white, or is it we have these sort of in the southeast of England, some constituency where you have hardly any residents or voters of immigrant origin. We also look at two other factors, namely what kind of friends or opponents do immigrants have in the European societies we're looking at, mobilization of anti-immigrant resentment, but also, of course, pro-immigrant mobilization. So this is a whole bundle of, so you can see we are interested in that representation, but we see this in a wider context and try to explain descriptive and substantive representation by going back these steps basically to contextual factors to understand. What are what countries are we looking at? I've just simply prepared a list. Originally, the Pathways project included 7 countries: France, Germany, Greece, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain, and the UK. But we have been joined by a sister project from Belgium, and so we are now comparing 8 European countries. That's an ambitious aim because the data that we collect are very, very detailed, very often very hard to obtain. Even Professor Marlis will speak about this. It is very hard to define what we mean by a citizen of immigrant origin to begin with, and to relate this to national statistics, which are often very different. So that is what we're looking at from roughly the early 1990s to more or less the present. We include the national level, but also the regional level. Although the window of observation for the regional level is a bit shorter, we look only at the latest completed parliament. We have a multi-level design, We look at the individual level, that's the MP, the member of parliament, or whatever the name is in the respective country. But that sort of MP's activities are nested in, first of all, in this electoral district, this constituency or constituency. We have data on the regional level, the variations between regions, and we also look at the national level. So we have quite a complex design that we, again, I think this is a very innovative part of the Pathways project, that we combine all of these different levels. Finally, what kind of variables, or if you like, factors or indicators are we looking at? At the national level, we collect a lot of data on, or are still collecting a lot of data on institutions. For example, electoral systems, policy variables, for example, immigration policy, naturalization policy, citizenship policy, integration policy, etc. We look at the national level of the party system. Is there a major challenger on the right that sort of would make it risky, perhaps, for conservative parties to nominate citizens of immigrant origin for parliamentary office? We look at public opinion at the national level, and we look at these mobilizations. At the district level, in the constituents, again, we look at institutional variables. Again, we look at the electoral system, because there may be differences, even within countries, between different districts. We look at the demography, socio-demography of representation in districts. What's the composition of the district, constituency, like in English parlance, in socioeconomic terms, how many immigrants live there, etc. We look at the party system at the district level, and what mobilization. In the regions, we have exactly the same, basically, again the institutions, again policies, again party system, etc. It goes on to the national level. It is a collaboration. It's a very, we have a lot of partners. There's a team in Germany, in Bamberg, around myself. Some other colleagues are here. There's a team in Leicester, at the University of Leicester, and at the University of Manchester. It was initially one team, but through changes in people's professional lives, it became two. There's a team in Amsterdam, at the University of Amsterdam, led by Jean Kelly. There's a team in Paris, led by Manuel Ginari, and we have enjoyed, and I've only put one name, although that's politically not entirely correct, by Jean-Benoît Pillet and others in Brussels. We are funded, that's the last thing I say, by four science organizations in Germany, in France, in Britain, and in the Netherlands. The ESRC is our funder in the United Kingdom. And obviously we couldn't have done this, and we are very grateful to our funders. And of course we are very grateful to the PSA to give us the opportunity to present our results today.
Great, so it's certainly an ambitious project, and it's multinational, multi-funder, and that's great. And let's move from the design to the findings. And Professor Morales will talk about the comparative findings, and then we'll move on to the UK.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for being here. As you've already heard from my colleague, Thomas Saalfeld, these are the countries that are included in our study. So we covered quite a bit of Western European democracies, and ideally we would like to cover the whole of Europe, but that's very ambitious and would require much more funding than we have for now. As Thomas was saying, we cover a wide range of terms across countries, but right now the data that we have finished collecting are mostly covering the 2000s and 2010s decades in all of the 8 countries studied. I'll move directly to the kind of key issue of what we're studying, and I will offer some key highlights of our findings, our comparative findings. Bear in mind that, as I said, we now only have the data collected since the 2000s, and we'll be going back to the 1990s as well, and collecting data on the regional level as well as what MPs are doing in Parliament. The first key issue to clarify is what do we consider to be a person or a citizen of immigrant origin. And this is a very tricky issue because, of course, individuals have different and multiple identities, and even if they might have parentage of immigrant origin, they might not identify themselves as of immigrant origin. But for the purposes of actually being able to compare how well people with immigrant background fare in terms of actually gaining elective office, what we're doing is defining from factual information that is publicly available as persons of immigrant origin, all those individuals who are either born themselves as foreign nationals, and these are what generally are defined as first-generation immigrants, or who have or had at least one parent of foreign nationality at birth. And this is what usually are regarded as second-generation migrants. Of course, the term second-generation migrants is a contested one, and it's legitimately a contested one. If you have, for instance, only your mother or your father of foreign origin, you might question why you should be regarded of immigrant origin rather than primarily of national origin, because only half of your parents actually are. But for the statistical purposes, this is the way we define it, and then we're not necessarily allocating identities or saying that these would be the permanent identities that MPs need to be articulating. It's quite important to underscore that our definition does not fully overlap, on the one hand, with very commonly used one, that of ethnic minorities, for instance, in the UK, but also in other countries. That term is commonly used, because a lot of the MPs that we will be studying and for which I will show you some data are actually not regarded as ethnic minorities, because perhaps their parents are of French origin in the UK or of Italian origin in the Netherlands. They might not be identifiable in terms of ethnicity or race easily. If your mother is only the one who's of immigrant origin, your name might not even be visible, because in most countries only your father's surname will be used. And it's also our definition not fully overlapping with the commonly used term of immigrants, because as I said before, a lot of the individuals that we are classifying as of immigrant origin did not migrate themselves. They were native-born children, and hence they're technically not immigrants themselves. So that clarifies what is the pool of individuals that we're considering as of immigrant origin and how they differ from other existing commonly used terms like ethnic minorities and immigrants. So now to the key highlights and findings. How many are there in the population, and how many actually reach parliament? You will have in your folders all of these PowerPoint presentations and also a leaflet, so then you can take home the figures. So I won't go into each of the figures one by one for the countries, and just give you the kind of general pictures. We are looking here, comparing in this graph, the statistics on the foreign-born, on the foreign nationals, because the statistics on the foreign-born and the offspring of the foreign-born are not easily available across countries. And admittedly, using the figures on foreign nationals is perhaps slightly problematic, because they don't include those that are already naturalized, so those that obtain the nationality of the country where they are now residing, and they don't include the children. But even if we look at those figures, which are, as I said, restrictive of the amount of people of immigrant origin that we have in all of these countries, what we find in the darker shade blue is the percentages of immigrant origin MPs, and in the lighter blue shade, the percentage of foreign nationals in each of the countries. In most of the countries, what we clearly see already is a huge underrepresentation of the population of immigrant origin. It might give you the sense that actually they're overrepresented in the Netherlands and in the UK, but I have to point out that that's not the case. This is only because our statistics of reference is the foreign nationals. And of course, both in the UK and the Netherlands, when you add up all those who naturalize, because they have very high rates of naturalization, and you add up also the children of the first generation migrants, the figures would actually still be in a
a slight underrepresentation of the real underlying population of immigrant origin. Nevertheless, what we can see once we take into consideration that extra part of the population is that the Netherlands and the UK are by far the two countries that are faring the best in terms of representing a number of, a proportion of people of immigrant origin that is more similar to the real proportion in the population. And in countries like Germany, Italy, Spain, and Greece and Italy, we have much lower proportions. What about the gender balance? Our findings show that immigrant origin MPs are more likely to be women in Belgium and Spain, but this is not a universal pattern. There's sometimes the feeling that perhaps minority women are favored in the selection process to become a candidate for national parliament because, in a sense, they tick two boxes. They are women and they are minorities, so they save parties the work of actually trying to find different individuals for those categories. And what we find is that this is actually not the case. In a lot of countries, the percentages of immigrant origin MPs and non-immigrant origin MPs that are female are quite similar. And that's, for instance, the case in Germany and the UK. And in other countries, you see the opposite trend or fluctuations over time. So not a clear kind of gender bias towards women, as in some previous studies would have suggested. What about age and education? Overall, we can say that in most countries, MPs of immigrant origin do tend to be younger, but there are some exceptions, and those are found in southern European countries, Greece and Spain, where they are older than other MPs, and actually these are two countries where we see that they depart considerably from a lot of the trends that we have. The largest gaps in terms of age are found in Germany and Greece, but in opposite directions. And when we look at levels of education, we find very high levels of university graduates across all of the countries and across all types of MPs, usually above 75%. In several countries, immigrant origin MPs are somewhat more likely to have a university degree, but not in all of them. Moving quickly on to the party profiles, in most countries, immigrant origin MPs are much more likely to be elected as candidates of a center-left party, except in Spain. And in most countries, the party profile of immigrant origin MPs is markedly different to that of the rest of the MPs. The final slide that I will show is in relation to differences in political experience, and our findings suggest that, generally speaking, immigrant origin MPs are somewhat less likely than the rest of the MPs to hold a leadership position in the national party organization, but differences are generally small. They're also less likely to have prior experience in elected local or regional office, but we also see, partly because of their younger age, that they're usually been sitting in parliament for a shorter period. In summary, the sort of key messages to take home, the Netherlands and the UK lead in the representation of citizens of immigrant origin in national parliaments. South European countries fare worst of the 8 countries that we have studied. There is, however, no single universal socio-demographic profile for MPs of immigrant origin across all of our countries, but they do tend, in most of the countries, to be younger and highly educated. Gender profiles vary substantially, and immigrant origin MPs tend to be elected in center-left parties, but not so much in Southern Europe, and they tend to have slightly less political experience before gaining a seat in national parliament. You'll find more information about the project on our website, and you can follow us on Twitter. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. Let's move straight on to the UK, findings presented by Maria Zaluska from the University of Manchester.
Thank you. You can already see, looking at the title of this presentation, is that I am going to exercise some considerable reasoning leaps here, because as anyone who knows anything about the narratives in Britain knows, we are not ever talking about citizens of immigrant origin and their representation in Britain. And so Britain does sit oddly with this project. And I'm going to try to persuade you that actually looking at the representation of immigrant origin people does have a huge amount of impact on our understanding of ethnic minority representation, which is the narrative that is politically salient in this country. Another comment immediately to be made here is that whereas in Europe it makes sense to be talking about representation of citizens of immigrant origin, in fact in Britain we really are talking about representation of residents of immigrant origin, and this is because Britain has a very different electoral law that enables most, in fact, of its immigrants to vote and stand for national elections, which is a unique setup across the world. And so out of the three main countries of immigration, currently, according to Office of National Statistics, which is India, Ireland, and Poland, only the Polish immigrants cannot almost immediately stand for parliament and vote in national elections. They are the only ones who need to obtain citizenship in order to do that. So perhaps unsurprisingly, given how much electoral power we give to our immigrants, almost immediately upon arrival, Britain is one of the leaders of representation of immigrant origin residents. The problem with this is, of course, that as Lara already mentioned, we don't actually know how many immigrants and their children reside in the United Kingdom. We do know how many immigrants we have, because this is a data collected by the census, but once they are children, we lose track of them. Unless they mark a different ethnicity in the census to the white British, which we know is not the case for a lot of white Irish immigrant origin people, for example, we lose track. So actually, given that we have 11% of MPs of immigrant origin, it is very hard to know whether actually that's a good result or not. So we think there is a gap, but how do we know? So here we are looking separately at those MPs who were actually born abroad, so they are first generation migrants, versus those who are second generation. And we do have a figure of 13% of residents of immigrant experience, so first generation immigrants in this country, but only 3% of them sit in our parliament. So we do now know that there is a percentage gap of 10% of underrepresentation of immigrants. So whereas this doesn't tell us very much of what the gap may be or may not be for people who are already born in Britain of immigrant origin, that does give you an idea that the result may lead us to think that actually the experience of immigration and immigrant origin could form a meaningful barrier to entry to politics. And of course we have a sense why. Maybe you have not been educated in this country, you don't have the kind of right know-how or networks to get in. However, that observation that immigration itself is a barrier does open up a certain lesson for our interpretations of the numbers and figures which we constantly receive about representation of ethnic minorities in this country. Because we have to remember that a lot of these ethnic minorities are immigrants themselves, or first generation, second generation sons and daughters of immigrants. So as an explanatory help, I think that's very important to actually look at other immigrant origin MPs and compare them. How do they fare in comparison to ethnic minority? And for the purposes of the project, we call those people who are visibly of ethnic minority origin, so normally what we would call ethnic or racial groups, visible because they can be identified very easily. And when you look at this graph, you can actually see that they are underrepresented amongst immigrant origin MPs as well. So given, for example, India, which is, and has been ever since really the 50s and 60s, has been one of the main sources of immigration to this country, they are hugely underrepresented in comparison to white Irish and white other group. This doesn't have actually the comparison figures of from the census, but especially the white Irish are significantly overrepresented in our parliament. So now, in order to move on from the debate, we already can see immigration is a barrier to entry, but actually the ethnic minority origin, the visibility, is a considerable another barrier that we have to think about. However, when you look at an over time picture, and here we have the last three completed parliaments, So elections of 2001, 2005 and 2010, we actually can see that the numbers of visible minorities, so ethnic minority MPs, have been rising faster than the overall numbers of immigrant origin MPs. So the gap between ethnic minority underrepresentation and immigrant origin underrepresentation is closing very slowly. And as Lara already said, this is the case throughout Europe, and it is also the case in Britain, that Labour, the left-wing parties, are at the forefront of representation of immigrants and minorities. Of course, we know this has a lot to do with who actually votes, so the pool of available politicians from that stock is much larger for left-wing parties. However, we can also see from this graph that the Conservative Party has been catching up quite significantly. Everybody knows that they have been very successful at recruiting a lot more ethnic minority MPs. So just to show this again in the next graph, it is the gap is closing very fast, and so we may want to maybe think it's a bit of a trend by now that actually Conservatives are doing quite well closing that gap. And this is quite interesting. Another difference that Britain has, as Lara said, that there are a lot of these arguments that being an ethnic minority woman may be an advantage to access parliament, but actually in Britain this kind of narrative is the rarer one. We normally are used to making arguments about how actually focus on ethnic minority representation may detract from gender representation, and we have struggled with a lot of narratives around how perhaps some immigrant groups are excluding women from their political lives and public lives, and how in fact that could be a negative relationship. And even though UK is not one of the countries that has a very strong trend on this, when you do look at the proportion of women as immigrant origin MPs versus non-immigrant origin MPs, we do see that all these arguments that are quite salient in Britain do not come to hold. So prioritizing immigrant origin representation and ethnic minority representation does nothing to harm gender representation. And we of course know this also looking at the new intake of, we have had the last two elections, a lot of Pakistani, Bangladeshi women, etc. So in a sense, it's a very positive story in Britain. We are one of the leaders, and the gender aspect is pointing us in the right direction. However, we do have to remember that these gaps are still there, and even though they are closing, immigration particularly seems to be quite a crucial barrier to entry, and ethnic minority origin is an additional and a separate barrier to entry on top of that immigration experience. So, as the project will go on, we are going to be trying to explore these issues in more depth, with a kind of more explanatory eye to it. And the first big question that we're going to be trying to deal with is about visibility. What drives this? Is it the anti-immigrant or potentially prejudicial attitudes amongst the population? What is it that makes visibility a barrier, immigration a barrier, but also trying to look to explain these over time trends of diminishing barrier to entry. I know this is a way in which Britain is actually a very useful exercise in this project, that Britain has a very different electoral system to all the other countries, and so we are going to be able to test what effect the electoral systems and electoral geographies have on representation of minorities, visible immigrants and other types of immigrants. And finally, we will try to look at how do different immigrant groups organize and why. And so we do have an inkling in Britain, for example, that a lot of people of white immigrant background just melt away at the moment they are nationalized, or they are the second generation immigrants. We barely know that they are there. And so one of the, for this presentation, I picked on this visibility as being only being of ethnic minority origin, but we are actually going to look into those immigrants who are also visible from the point of view of having foreign names still, and see if that makes a difference as well. So hopefully it will be a quite deeply explanatory project that will answer all your questions that you may or may not have had about representation of immigrant origin.
That takes us very nicely into questions and discussion. Around 20 minutes to just perhaps talk over